Federalist 54, Part 1. This is one of the most difficult Federalist Papers to read because it talks about the issue of slavery indirectly and then directly on why the Constitution, people in the Convention, Philadelphia Convention, decided to make this compromise of allowing the southern states that had a lot of the slaves to count their states, count their slaves as 3/5 of a person when it came to getting representation in the House of Representatives. Every 10 years, according to the Constitution, there would be a census that would count the number of people in the United States, and depending on what the population of states were, every state would get a certain number of representatives to send to the House of Representatives. And during the course of Philadelphia Convention, they realized the only way they could make a compromise and get the southern states to join in the Union was to allow them to count their enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. Because the Southerners were turning around and saying, well, if you're going to tax us, if the federal government is going to tax us, counting the enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, then we should get representation based on that. So they had to come up with this, what is called a very dark stain on the Constitution, had to come up with this compromise. Now one day, I'll hopefully talk about this a little bit more to you in a separate occasion. But here, let me just go ahead and read it. That would be the best way to proceed, I think. Madison writes, "The next view which I shall take of the House of Representatives relates to the appointment of its members to the several states, which is to be determined by the same rule with that of direct taxes. It is not contended that the number of people in each state ought not to be standard for regulating the proportion of those who are to represent the people of each state. The establishment of the same rule for the apportionment of taxes will probably be as little contested, though the rule itself in this case is by no means founded on the same principle. In the former case, the rule is understood to refer to the personal rights of the people, with which it has a natural and universal connection. In the latter, it has reference to the proportion of wealth of which it is no case a precise measure, and in ordinary cases a very unfit one. But, notwithstanding the imperfection of the rule as applied to the relative wealth and contributions of the states, it is evidently the least exceptionable among the practicable rules, and had too recently obtained general sanction of America not to have found a ready preference with the convention." So when you're familiar with the language of Madison, you know that he's really having a hard time talking about it, because as we see, this is the only Federalist that majority of it, Madison says, let me present to you the case of a Southern person, how they would look at this thing if we don't allow them to count their enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. So you can already see that because he himself is a Southerner, but wants to come across as a non-Southerner in this state, he goes at length to say a Southerner would say this. In other words, I'm too embarrassed to accept it myself because I'm a Southerner and this is probably what I believe, but he quotes a Southern person for a few paragraphs, and we'll get to it here in a little bit. So wanted you to keep that in mind, that this is not the language that he's very comfortable using, because he knows it has to do with slavery. And also the 3/5 number, that was something that they had to come up with during the Continental Congress, during the first, right during the Revolutionary War, when they got the Confederation going. That was a number that they compromised on, and that number stuck. So they used it again during the Philadelphia Convention. So the next paragraph, as this is admitted, it will perhaps be said, but does it follow from an admission of numbers for the measure of representation, or of slaves combined with free citizens as a ratio of taxation, that slaves ought to be included in the numerical rule of representation? Slaves are considered as property, not as persons. They ought, therefore, to be comprehended in estimates of taxation which are founded on property, and to be excluded from representation which is regulated by a census of persons. This is the objection, as I understand it, stated in its full force. I shall be equally candid in stating the reasoning which may be offered on the opposite side. So this is what a lot of Northerners have been thinking and talking about, but now I'm going to tell you what the Southerners, an average Southerner, would talk about. And from here on out, for the next few paragraphs, he's going to supposedly quote an unidentifiable Southern person. Because he says, we subscribe to the doctrine, might one of our Southern brethren observe, that representation relates more immediately to persons, and taxation more immediately to property. And we join in the application of this distinction to the case of our slaves. But we must deny the fact that slaves are considered merely as property, and in no respect whatever as persons. The true state of the case is that they partake of both these qualities, being considered by our laws in some respects as persons and in other respects as property, in being compelled to labor not for himself but for a master, in being vendible by one master to another master, and in being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body by the capricious will of another. The slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property, in being protected, on the other hand, in his life and in his limbs, against the violence of others, even the master of his labor and his liberty, and being punishable himself for all violence committed against others, the slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of the society, not as a part of irrational creature. As a moral person, not as a mere article of property. The federal Constitution, therefore, decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves when it views them in the mixed character of persons and of property. This is, in fact, their true character. It is the character bestowed on them by the laws under which they live, and it will not be denied that these are the proper criteria. Because it's only under the pretext that the laws have transformed the Negroes into subjects of property that a place is disputed them in the computation of numbers, and it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have been taken away, the Negroes could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with the other inhabitants. Look, even Madison, even when he's quoting a supposed an unidentified Southern person, his language is not as clear and as beautifully written as most of his other essays and papers. So just think about that. And one thing that I want you to think as we read on, is that back 2-3 centuries ago, they identified the word property and justice in a way that was much closer than the way we talk about it now. Because remember, a lot of these founders were influenced by John Locke's philosophy and the way he'd seen things. And John Locke, in his one of the treaties that he'd written, instead of the way the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, on and on and on, and then life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In John Locke's way of saying it was life, liberty, and property. So property is very important. So as we go through this and you look at the way they use the language, even though it's horrible to us, just keep in mind that back then, because of the circumstances, because of the situation the way it was, they looked at property and the idea of justice a little differently than we do these days. And an extremely important thing to remember is that these southern states, especially these two southern states, had the population of their enslaved people was much larger than the population of their free people. So they were, at the time of writing of the Constitution, this was the reality, and they just didn't know what to do with it. And it's just makes for difficult reading, but it's something that we have to think about and talk about.